Josh, how many bullets do they have left to shoot? And are they getting towards the end?
Yes, it does seem like we are towards the final innings, and there's so many catalysts that lead us to believe that there will be a lot of price movement next week. If we are wrong, then don't hate us. But let's run into the data. So we're going to go into the GME failed to deliver. This is going to be slightly difficult to read, so Justin's going to use his mouse to direct us. And the far left, we just have the settlement date and when they failed to deliver. From that date where they failed, they have 35 days of forced coverage. And when did we start to see some price run-ups? We saw it around February 8th where we had these FTDs that were forced covered. There was $300,000 worth or 1,269. And then we just see an increasing number of these FTDs when we saw the price movement of GME continue to rise. And then we get towards next week where we see a lot of these that really start to develop. What you're going to probably say is, well, I see the 11th here. And on the 11th, there was 170,000 FTD changes. But why didn't we see massive price movement? There should have been massive price movement, right, Justin? There should have been. Well,
one would assume.
Yes. So give me the counter argument to this. Why didn't we see this?
Right. So first off, I don't know what the counter argument for it would be. I've got to guess, and I want to emphasize guess here. We've seen an interesting uptick that we haven't seen before, or at least since I think it was July-ish or so of 2021, where you're seeing the publicly reported shares of GME that can be borrowed, the utilization, creep up. In other words, there are more shares, at least in the public sphere, that are being loaned out and being requested. You're seeing cost to borrow these shares creep up, and you're seeing availability of these shares go down, implying that people are borrowing more. So just shooting from the hip here, I would guess that maybe one explanation for this is that if we can see this pile up occurring right here, so can the people who are short. And the people who are short know that they've got, a bit of a problem coming up at the end of this past week and going into the following week. Well, maybe one of the ways you kind of get in front of that problem is you just borrow whatever you can, even if you have to go back onto the open market. Maybe a way to think about this would be, ideally, if you've got to borrow cash, the cheapest way to do it might be you take out a home equity line of credit or you refinance your home. But to do that, takes, time. That's not a transaction you can close very easily. Versus, let's say, just doing a cash advance on your credit card, which you can do in the twinkling of an eye. But the point is that even though the credit card you can do much quicker, there's many more fees associated with that. There's a higher interest rate or whatever. It's not preferable.
This is just speculation because we do see these utilizations and these FTDs fail to deliver these T plus 35 days that a lot of them were expiring this week where we saw this big price movement. We saw the move from 100 to 120. And may I also add, the market was tanking Friday where GME was up slightly. I don't really know how to discount that, as Justin always says. Like, what happens if the market's tanking but GME's flat? Is that bearish? Is it bullish? We don't actually know. But just that's something to add. We do see the utilizations creeping up. We see the cost to borrow increasing. We see so much of this smoke that keeps on building up, and we're starting to see some of these sparks with them. So with some price movement, Justin said this isn't even we're not even in the car of the date yet. We're calling the Uber, and there's a long way to run. And then what we see right here is Citadel down 10% year to date, which is just terrible. They do have $19 billion left, but Justin,
when I look at this, going back to this thing right here. So this was the first thing we showed you talking about FTDs. I think that there's multiple pieces that are playing in part of this. So failure to deliver is very much a component of, should we say, the short interest theme for GME. There's other themes as well that go on. For example, the option chain theme. So it's conceivable that more options could have been issued than shares actually, that is, call options could have been issued than shares actually exist. And if that is the case, back up.
It is most certainly. There's only about 290,000 of these contracts, would be like 29 million shares. So, Justin, I have a few questions for you regarding these FTDs and the new news that just came out saying that they're directly tied to the DTCC. Do you think you could describe this to us a bit further and what this actually means?
Gotcha. So let's do a quick little deep dive here on synthetic shares creations through FTDs. I use the example of Lunchables. Imagine that you are at a gas station in the middle of nowhere, and for whatever odd reason, you really need tomatoes. But because the gas station doesn't sell tomatoes, you've got a problem because you have to buy tomatoes. But you see that they have Lunchables, and within the Lunchable, there's like 3 tomatoes, 3 pieces of cheese, 3 crackers, whatever, right? So what you do is you buy a bunch of Lunchables to rip the Lunchables apart because you just want the tomatoes. Everything else in the Lunchable you don't really care about. That's kind of the way to think about these ETFs and how they can create shares, both of the underlying components that comprise the ETF, as well as you can create shares of the ETF by supplying the basket of shares back to the ETF. So let me say that in English here. If you are an authorized participant of an ETF, you can redeem a minimum number of shares, and XRT is a good example of this with its, negative 1,300% short interest. Jesus. Well, anyways, another topic of conversation. But the point is that you can redeem, I think, a minimum 50,000 shares of XRT, and you then get the various, sub shares that make up, the ETF there. So this is where I start getting really, really weak, but I believe this to be more right than wrong and more on the conceptual level than on the actual nuts and bolts level. So with that little thing out of the way, let's say that you're going through and you redeem 500,000 shares of XRT. Well, in the process of doing so, the DTC will allow the person who does the redemption to be credited with IOU shares or synthetic shares of whatever the basket was made up of. So, for example, if let's say pulling numbers on my backside here, redeeming 1 million shares of XRT might net someone with 10,000 shares of GME. That is to say 10,000 synthetic IOU shares of GME per the DTCC. Now, when it's redeemed, what will happen is the authorized participant who actually does the redemption will put these shares onto their books as a long position. In other words, listen, we now have 10,000 shares of GME, we have 15,000 shares of this other stock, 20,000, and so on and so on, just however the proportions work out. They can then turn around and they can then use these shares, these synthetic shares, as a long to satisfy and pair up with a short position they might have.
Justin, what are you saying right here? That on these balance sheets that actually show that they're long the stock, when in fact they made synthetic shares to go short?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how else to describe this, but it's just to be blunt, it's financial masturbation. Is what it boils down to.
And then what we also just found out is, Justin, what happened is, how are these guys crediting each other? How if you're the broker? I mean, if I'm Citadel, I mean a random firm that wants
a certain Chicago-based market maker who has a castle-based marketing motif. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, who happens to fly his jet with a bunch of mayo inside. Yes, if you are one of these firms, then and I need these shares. How am I? And you're the ETF creator. How are we going to make this transaction? Because you trust me, I trust you, right?
And the DTC trusts all of us.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyways, yeah. And everyone else, I guess, trusts the DTC, which is probably part of the problem. So, right. So one way we might do it is let's say that, you've got Josh Corp and Justin Corp, and both of us are authorized participants, sophisticated marketing or whatever, blah, blah, blah. So what I might say is, okay, Josh Corp, I know you're a little short on needing, this, particular share, but I also know that if you go into the open market and start having to borrow these shares, or even worse, buying back these shares, you're going to put too much buy pressure on the stock, particularly if everyone's looking at the stock. So we need to get shares onto your balance sheet, but we need to do it discreetly. We need to do it in a way that doesn't attract too much attention, and more importantly, stays within the letter of the law, even if it doesn't stay within the spirit of the law. So Justin Corp might sell short to Josh Corp, again, pulling numbers on my backside, 1 million shares of XRT. Now, the cool thing about XRT from this perspective is that it's an open-ended fund, meaning that you can issue as many shares of XRT as you want. This would stand in contrast to a closed-end fund. The number one funds that come to my mind would be like PSLV or PHYS, the Sprott Physical Metal Trust Funds. Separate topic of conversation, but the point is XRT can issue as many shares as they want. So I sell these shares short on my side, but because I sold them short, they then go onto Josh's Corp's balance sheet as a long position. So now Josh Corp has 1 million shares of XRT that have just been conjured up out of thin air, which is really to say he has 1 million shares from Justin Corp of IOU XRT that the DTC stands behind. Josh Corp then takes these 1 million shares and then redeems them for the underlying basket of equities that make up XRT. So again, just to keep my math relatively simple, let's say GME represents about 1% of XRT. Just work with me here. Well, 1% of 1 million shares redeemed, I think, comes to 10,000, right, Josh?
Math, right to me.
Yeah, math, yeah. Says the accountant who's bad at math. Anyways, the point is that, so now all of a sudden, when this redemption process occurs, there's now, Josh Corp has redeemed his IOU XRT shares through the DTC or through the redemption mechanism for this that is again backed up by the DTC for 10,000 shares of GME, 20,000 shares of, let's say, Bed Bath and Beyond, or whatever the various subcomponents are. This is the ripping apart the Lunchable, right, where you've got all these different things, but you really don't want the tomatoes. So here's the interesting thing now: even though these shares are still synthetics, they're IOUs. The IOUs are still guaranteed by DTC or whatever the subsister company is. They often would guarantee the settlement, but the point is that they're guaranteed to be settled by the system. So then Josh, if let's say a short, going back to, thank you, Josh. So let's say Josh Corp is a little short on one of these dates that he needs to have, some long shares to satisfy these failure to delivers. Because I think at the end of the day, you need a long in order to close out a failure to deliver, which I believe is an implied short. If I'm not right on that, I don't think I'm entirely wrong. But again, this is I'm kind of weak on the metrics here. But if nothing else, conceptually think about it like that. So the point is that you go through, you do all that stuff, and now you're able to satisfy at least part of your obligation for this. Now, that being said, we still have to deal with the obligation that Josh Corp owes to Justin Corp, because I'm owed back, a million shares of XRT, and Josh Corp has ripped apart the million shares that I shorted him, or that I sold short to him that he reported as long in the first place on that front. And so this is where you come into the concept of the basket creation, because just as the basket redemption process allowed Josh Corp to rip apart, the Lunchable, rip apart the shares of XRT to get the one thing that he wanted, he can also put these shares back together to reassemble the Lunchable, or reassemble whatever you need of XRT to recreate a share of XRT. So in this particular situation, there was a ruling that came out, or there was something that came out on, and the net of this is that the DTC, or the SEC, I should say, will allow a substitution of an individual equity, if that individual equity is hard to acquire, in order to recreate a basket, or in order to recreate redemptions.
Yeah, I think people understand that. There's one more thing that is really going to blow your mind here. The way that we are transacting is the exact same to Ghost Ledger. Then you're saying, okay, well, how much collateral is XRT? If I'm big Citadel and you're XRT, how much capital do I have to put up when these transactions are being done? It's all just fugazis. There's nothing. You're gonna say, I trust you, you trust me. There's nothing.
Oh, and it's deeper than that. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, Justin Corp, might be suspicious of Josh Corp, just as Josh Corp might be suspicious of Justin Corp. But at the end of the day, there's no honor among thieves. And it's a type of thing where, like, I know that if I call someone else that's weak, if I'm the one that starts the problem, the knives from everyone else who's doing the exact same bullshit that I'm doing are going to come out too. So it's one of these things where
there's nothing that's being done on their balance sheets. They're just making these transactions with nothing. There's nothing backing them. Like it's like if a bank, let's say I'm a bank and Justin's another bank, and you have to transfer these dollar liabilities to each other, because dollars on a bank's balance sheet are actually liabilities, and you don't want a balance sheet full of liabilities. So when you pass off liabilities, you're supposed to pass off an offsetting asset, which is usually in the form of a reserve or another type of asset on a bank's balance sheet. But what you can do in the Eurodollar system, which is just offshore banks still transacting in these dollars, and you can really do this anywhere prior to 2008 and still today, is you just give an IOU. So I transfer $1 million of dollar liabilities onto Justin's balance sheet, and all we say, instead of netting those $1 million worth of liability with $1 million worth of asset to net each other's position, instead we just keep a scoreboard and we say, okay, Justin, Josh,
trust me, bro.
Yeah, and then we just go back and forth, never calling each other on those liabilities, because we never need to call each other. Because if there's
no, and it's deeper, because just as you and I might be transacting, we're transacting with everyone else, and the first person that blinks, the entire thing just it's a very
in 2008, and someone called the bluff. So what? This is the same thing that's happening in the equity markets today.
Yeah, but sorry, just to intervene, like in 2008, what happened was that you had the centrals come in, and the centrals basically bought the shitty toxic assets and put them on mortgage-backed securities in this case, and that's what they used to recapitalize.
And so after everything blew up, that's when the Fed came in. But I mean, we've never recovered. I mean, the Eurodollar system has never once recovered since this. And I think the exact same thing could happen with these synthetic shares today. If someone starts calling upon these, then it is just going to be a colossal contagion fudge, mayhem, where it could be the biggest financial event since 2008 if it happens to the extent which we think it could, but it probably won't because we don't know too much about anything. Please do not take us for financial advice.
So the point is that when I have to go back, or when you return the basket of stocks, or when you return the various subcomponents, going back to my Lunchables example, it's like the SEC is saying, okay, well, listen, instead of supplying tomatoes, which you really want, which you're really short, you can supply, I don't know, maybe a little bit of cucumbers and celery or whatever, right? And so it's one of these things where you have this stuff that's being transmuted into other things, but it's not an accurate representation of what's actually going on. This takes us back to kind of the three things that I see kind of colliding all at once here, that I've been able to identify, and there's probably more, with GME. Number one, there's a question of the short interest. What is the actual short interest on GME? I have no idea. And if you think you know, you probably don't. Maybe the DTC has an inkling of it, but whatever.
It's just like the Eurosystem. They have absolutely no clue because they are on their balance sheet.
Yeah. So number one, what is the short interest of GME? So that's the first thing that would create
calculations where we think it's well over 500%. If you want to look at that video.
Yeah, it's just, yeah, whatever. The second thing is that what is the effect of retail taking a mass interest in directly registering their shares in their own name and taking it off of the DTC's books, basically reducing the available float?
I've never seen this happen before. Number three.
Yeah, second one. And the third one is, what's the effect of the option chain, particularly if retail starts picking up heavy options and then starts redeeming the options for actual shares of GME to an extent that's materially more than the option market makers had priorly thought would be a logical conclusion.
Example, the option makers are positioned in a way where they have everything calculated. You hear me say it every time. So what happens if they have their plugged-in data where the maximum amount of pain that they will ever take is a 5% expiration? We don't know what these numbers are. Probably 1 to 3% of options ever get exercised. And maybe their max pain is 5%. What happens if 20, 30% of options get expired? That will be a big hole and a lot of bums. And then, fourth, I will add one more. What is the government's response to this? And that is the biggest caveat, the biggest red flag. Who knows if they do a bailout and never let the squeeze happen? Like that.
Yeah. Or actually, Josh, let me give you a lens to look at it in. I would say that the government and the regulators will always do what the government and regulators have done. They will look after their own interests, which means that the real question is, how do the interest of the government, the self-serving interest of governments and regulators, how do they align with retail? Or how do they align with the entrenched players? I don't know the answer to that, but that's what I would think about that.
What if they can prevent this squeeze from ever happening? What if, since these DTCC shares are they're synthetics and they're being artificially short, what if they sweep them under the rug? They said, oh, well, forget about those, and then maybe we see a mini squeeze and MOAC doesn't happen, and then everyone gets a small piece of what they think, but they indirectly bail everything out without this would be highly illegal, but when has that ever really stopped anyone before? And I'm just saying these are possibilities, which is why I keep the probabilities of this happening low, because who knows what the government's response will be.
And that's why you get all the hate mail.
Now on, if you want to give us hate mail, please at gmailjustin.com. Then for me, you can send me some love notes, and I would very much appreciate it. But we will give a quick disclaimer, because apparently Justin said, I don't think the feds would like us shilling this too much. So please do not take us for any financial advice. If you do, you have issues of your own, that you should probably see a doctor, psychiatrist, or any of the above now.
In other words, it's on your dumb ass, not ours.
Other than that, I would love to see you guys again.
Oh, Josh, one more closing thing, just really quick here. History repeating itself. In 1998, when LTCM blew up, you had Blacks and Scholes that were there, like, the Black Scholes model for pricing options. You have the same thing that's playing out right now, and I'm very curious with the geopolitical situation we've got going on right now. And boy, if you think you can understand geopolitics, you have another thing coming. But I just kind of note that once again, Russia's kind of in the headlines. Once again, we're kind of getting ourselves set up for like a financial come to Jesus moment. And once again, we have the very same people who are at LTCM, with these models. And I'm not trying to say they're smart, very, very sophisticated, very, 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 very smart people. But boy, does this sure seem to echo the past.
Yes, and this is also very much our biased view. So do not